computer. Okay, so we're starting recording, and I'm verifying that I am spotlit. And I'm going to mute everybody, and you co-hosts, see if you can unmute yourself. If you can't, I'll do it.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can be muted or unmuted at your, but if you need to say something to me. So let's see here.
One question.
Yeah.
Whenever you're reading a section, would it be possible for you to preface that with what page?
Yes, I've corrected that situation by noting the page numbers. So I'll try to do that. And let me see here. I want the view for speaker. Okay. Welcome to session number 5 of Exploring the Situationists. And this time we have 2 co-hosts, Peter and Kim. Our third one, Danny, is out of town for this meeting. But they'll be admitting people and helping out, checking the chat and so on. So I'm going to just plunge right in here. We have 11 articles out of this one journal, number 10, which I believe was in 1966. So of those 11, there are 3 of them, or 4 of them rather, that are pretty much analyses of social events, struggles, or something going on in the world. And then there are 7 of them that are mostly shorter things that I tentatively thought, to oversimplify things, they are obstacles to social struggles. And you'll see the events are the address to revolutionaries of Algeria and other countries, the class struggles in Algeria, the contributions to a councilist program in Spain, and the article about the Watts riot. And the shorter ones in this order will be Sartre, Godard, and Daniel Guérin. Each of them is critiqued in different ways. And then I've put another topic is that little list of topics by Vanagim, and then Captive Words by Mustafa Kayati about language, and a thing about alienation, and a thing called The Ideology of Dialogue, which brings up this issue of breaks and stuff like that again. So the first 3 I'm going to do in one lump, and then we'll do the Watts riot in one thing just by itself, and then Sartre, Godard, Guérin in one, and then those remaining 4. So we'll have 4 little sections here, about 20 or 30 minutes each, with Q&A after them. So starting out with the address to revolutionaries of all countries. What I'm going to try to do this time is maybe not read quite so much, but I'm going to very quickly summarize what's in this. So this was published originally in Algeria, but it was addressed to everybody, and it was soon thereafter translated into French, Arabic, German, Spanish, and English. So they're saying, they start out, the collapse of the revolutionary image is coming after the collapse of the revolution 50 years later or 40 years later, something like that. And then they mention what's going on in Algeria at that time. There has just been a coup d'etat, which we'll be discussing in a few minutes. And then they have some more general things about the coherence, how these things relate to each other. And they mention these things that among the different things, they said a revolutionary movement in the world has to know what its past is. And number one, it has to know that its past failed. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere if we pretend that it was partially successful. And so they mention it's first of all necessary to recognize, without holding onto any consoling illusions, the full extent of the defeat of the entire revolutionary project in the first third of this century, and its official replacement in every region of the world and every domain in life by delusive shams and petty reforms that camouflage and preserve the old order. The domination of bureaucratic state capitalism, i.e. Stalinism, over the workers is the opposite of socialism. This is a fact that Trotskyism has refused to face. Socialism exists wherever the workers themselves directly manage the entire society. It therefore exists neither in Russia, nor China, nor anywhere else. The Russian and Chinese revolutions were defeated from within. Today, they provide the Western proletariat and the peoples of the Third World with a false model, which actually serves as a mere counterbalance to the power of bourgeois capitalism and imperialism. And then they proceed to, again, talking about general things about revolution. And then towards the latter portion of the text, they go to specific countries. And so they say the next revolutions can find aid in the world only by attacking this world as a whole. The freedom movement of the American blacks, if it can assert itself incisively, will call into question all the contradictions of modern capitalism. It must not be sidetracked by the black nationalism and black capitalism of the black Muslims. The workers of the United States, like those in England, are engaging in wildcat strikes, and they put them in quotes because it's kind of a new concept, against the bureaucratized unions that aim, first of all, at integrating them into the concentrated, semi-regulated capitalist system. It is with these workers and with the students who have just won their strike at the University of California in Berkeley, it's the FSN, that a new North American revolution can be made, and not with the Chinese atom bomb. So they're putting things in perspective. Next paragraph. The movement drawing the Arab peoples towards unification and socialism has achieved a number of victories over classical colonialism. But it is more and more evident that it must finish with Islam, an obviously counter-revolutionary force, as are all religious ideologies. It must grant freedom to the Kurdish people. It must stop swallowing the Palestinian pretext that justifies the dominant policy in the Arab states, a policy that insists on the destruction of Israel and therefore perpetuates itself, since this destruction is impossible. The repressive forces of the state of Israel can be undermined only by a model of revolutionary society realized by the Arabs. Just as the success of a model of a revolutionary society somewhere in the world would mark the end of the largely sham confrontation between the East and the West, it would also mean the end of the Arab-Israel confrontation, which is a miniature reproduction of it. And then they go on to talk about things in the Congo and so on, and Spain, which we'll get to later, and so on. And then it ends with a series of long lives, vive, that in a very dramatic way concretize what they've been talking about, because they've been kind of talking about general things. And they're saying, okay, here we're going to pick out 6 things, very varied, that we can say, yes. It doesn't mean they're the total solution, but we're saying this is a good move. this is promising or whatever. So they start out, long live the comrades who in 1959 burned the Koran in the streets of Baghdad. Long live the workers' councils of Hungary, defeated in 1956 by the so-called Red Army. Long live the dockers of Aarhus, that's in Denmark, who last year effectively boycotted racist South Africa in spite of their union leadership and the judicial repression by the Danish Social Democratic government. Long live the Zengakuren student movement of Japan, which actively combats the capitalist powers of imperialism and of the so-called communist bureaucracies. Long live the workers' militia that defended the northeastern districts of Santo Domingo and Dominican Republic. Long live the self-management of the Algerian peasants and workers. The option is now between the militarized bureaucratic dictatorship and the dictatorship of the self-managed sector extended to all production and all aspects of social life. So then going on to the class struggles in Algeria, which I forgot to, this starts at page 203 and goes for about 10 pages there. And in this, again, I'm going to be very summary. Basically, they're analyzing what has been happening in Algeria since the coup by Boumediene, a military coup that was back in July or June. And now they're writing this, I think, in November or December of that same year, 1965. So basically, Ben Bella was sort of he was the figurehead leader. He was the president of Algeria after it got its independence from France in 1962 or 3. And he was sort of radical. And also sort of, he had these military people with him and all this. And during this period, when a lot of, French owners had left Algeria in a panic after France had backed out, there were a lot of self-managed factories in Algeria and farms and so on. And just because the workers are peasants, what else were they going to do? The bosses had left. And so Ben Bella was in a kind of ambiguous situation here. Like, did he support those? Well, yeah. But on the other hand, it's illegal because you're taking somebody's property and blah, blah, blah. So this had been going on for 2 or 3 years here. And then when there's a coup d'etat against Ben Bella, then things become more drastically clear. And so it's talking about, why did this happen? How did it happen? Ben Bella was supposed to be in control. And then they're saying, well, yeah, but he let these military people, that was part of his power base. And then the military people throw him aside when they don't need the figurehead anymore. And so anyway, they're analyzing what's going on in Algeria, that there are different theories of self-management, a lot of rhetoric about it. There was this one guy in the sort of leadership who was a somewhat more radical guy named Mohammed Harbi or RB, who was sort of in favor of self-management, but he didn't really do anything about it. He just, was an ideologue for that. And of course, after the coup d'etat, he was arrested. And they're saying, oh, where did this self-management go now that you're arrested? And they're pointing out that real self-management wouldn't have allowed that to happen. They would have prevented the coup, and he and Ben Bella would have had their defenders. So they go on towards the end, they're kind of building up, okay, like what's the option now? Like, you still have some self-managed factories. What are they going to do? Or farms or whatever. And so then they say, Self-management must be both the means and the end of the present struggle. It is not only what is at stake in the struggle, but also its adequate form. It is its own tool. Is itself the material it works on and its own presupposition. It must totally recognize its own truth. The state power proposes the contradictory and absurd project of reorganizing self-management. It is, in fact, self-management that must organize itself as a power or disappear. Such self-management, by the simple fact that it exists, threatens the society's entire hierarchical organization. It must destroy all external control, because all the external forces of control will never make peace with it as a living reality, but at most only with its label, with its embalmed corpse. Self-management cannot coexist with any army or police or state. Next paragraph. Radical self-management, the only kind that can endure and conquer, refuses any hierarchy within or outside itself. It must also reject in practice, underlined, any hierarchical separation of women. Parenthesis, an oppressive separation openly accepted by Proudhon's theory, the famous anarchist, 19th century, as well as by the backward reality of Islamic Algeria. The self-management committees, as well as all the delegates in the federations of self-managed enterprises, should be revocable at any moment by the base. This base obviously including all the workers without any distinction between permanent and seasonal ones, or employed and unemployed, in other words. Next article, contribution to a councilist program in Spain. I'll be more brief about this. The article simply talks about situations under Franco's Spain, which is still, a harsh, more or less fascistic dictatorship, but Franco is very old at this time, and it's envisageable that pretty soon that will no longer be there. So the question is, what will fill the power vacuum? And so the SI is looking at this group, this radical journal called Acción Comunista, and saying, hey, we agree with a lot of the things these people are saying. But here's some other suggestions and so on. And one of the things that they like about the Action Communist people is that their explicit aim is that workers' commissions, which are sort of like not unions, but they're sort of like an informal workers group that doesn't have a bureaucracy, that they would increasingly take power and transition themselves into being workers' councils, which is a revolutionary thing. So they quote a little bit about that, and that's and what the problems would be there. So I think I'm going to stop there, so we'll have time for some Q&A about these three articles. So if you have you can raise your digital hand, and you can, or you can type a question in the chat. So do we have any digital questions here? Judy. Okay, just a minute here. Just mute. Spotlight. Okay.
Hey, Ken, would you elaborate a little bit on the bureaucracy theory? Because it's really hard for me to imagine life without some kind of bureaucracy. I don't see how that, I don't understand that. And they seem to be just in so, bureaucracy is the worst. But how can human life exist and people work, who pays them, who does this and that? I mean, it seems like you have to have some kind of bureaucracy. So
well, you may have to have some people doing stuff that, that maybe a million people are not doing it. You're saying, hey, you dozen people, please do this. But the dozen people should not be locked into office. Like, oh, if you don't, either they're permanent, like in Russia or something like, or China, where you can't do anything about it without getting killed, or they're temporary, but they're temporary like, oh, well, if you don't like it, vote for somebody else 4 years from now. Screw you. That has, it's like people are taking a power and they're not accountable, or it's very clumsy to account them. Like maybe once in a while, one of them gets arrested for bribery or something, but most of the things are going on. So they're saying that is not necessary. There have been many societies that have functioned in various ways without that. And as for, you mentioned being paid, that's another question. There have been societies that work without money or without those other things. The point is, it's like a general democracy. And I don't want to go any farther than that, but it's like when they say bureaucrats, it's like this is a hierarchical thing where these people are bossing other people around, and there's nothing much you can do. You may be able to get rid of one of them, but somebody else is going to come in and serve the same function. So, Mike Bellard.
Hi, I just wanted to ask. I did in these writings that have read or supposed to have read, have any mention of changing the what Marx would call the mode of production from commodity production for sale to just production for use and distribution on the basis of
for sure. Yeah.
Okay, that's all.
ABC.
Thanks. Okay, that's ABC. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat from Sabrina,
Uh-huh.
and it says, what would a model of a revolutionary society realized by Arabs look like according to situationist ideals?
Well, it would look very similar to what they're talking about in Spain, where they get a little bit more specific. Namely, if the Arab population in general, peasants or workers or whatever, were taking over their things and not being ruled by bureaucratic dictators or by parliaments or armies, police, etc., then that kind of thing, they're saying that could inspire people in Israel in a very different way than being inspired like by this sort of black and white thing, that we're seeing go on right now, where you attribute to the enemy all your problems. And so everything is focused on that. And you forget that you have these bosses over you that are using this to manipulate you. And so what they say about the Arab, they're saying that there were some victories that Arab people had over classical colonialism, but they were just replaced by military dictatorships or even monarchies and things like this. So, how to picture it. I mean, there was in this article we'll read 4 weeks from now, it's mentioned that in the 30s, there was one of the most gigantic general strikes in history among the Arab countries. And it lasted several months. It was something almost, I don't think it's ever been equaled. And I don't know, it was eventually defeated, but, it showed that those people were capable of doing something like that. So that's all we can say. As long as the Arabs don't have that, then they are not going to inspire imitation by either Israel or anyone else.
May I also add something?
Please.
The Situationists couldn't have known about this because it's much more recent, but there is a revolution going on currently in northern Syria called Rojava, Rojava,
Right.
and it adopts a lot of the principles that occurred in Spain in the 1930s during the Civil War, and also what the Situationists are talking about, self-management and horizontalism,
Right.
a lot of the same characteristics.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that and also related to that, the Kurds in Turkey were, interestingly enough, were inspired by Murray Bookchin, the well-known ecological anarchist guy. So I think that may have bled over into the Syria thing to some extent, even though that's not Kurds there, I don't think. But
no, they are. Well, it's a variety of different people.
Right.
And they were definitely influenced by Abdullah Öcalan, who was influenced by Murray Bookchin.
Right.
And by the way, Öcalan is in prison for life.
Right. In Turkey.
Yeah, on an island somewhere in the Mediterranean.
Bruce Ellen.
Yeah, you guys pretty much just said the things I was going to say. Is that this phenomenon in Rojava, I think, is directly traces back to Murray Bookchin and the close association that developed between him and the leader of the PKK, the Kurdish guerrilla movement, which in its original form was Marxist-Leninist, but then the leadership of that organization subsequently embraced a lot of Murray Bookchin's ideas and basically threw out Marxism and Leninism. And I think what exists in Rojava is a practical application of those ideas that transferred between the leader, Murray Bookchin, and the leader of the PKK.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's I'm glad you brought that up, Kim and Bruce. As you say, that's much more recent. That's like 30 or 40 years after this article.
Yeah.
But it's an example of the kind of potential that's there if there's a breakthrough. For example, they have a whole different thing with the status of women in that movement, and with popular democratic forms and stuff like that, recallable, to get back to the thing about bureaucracy, they have some leaders there, but those movements are already modifying that pretty drastically, by saying, well, they have to be reelected every month or every week or something like this, and they can be recalled, and they don't become just new people like the people in our Congress or something who are just, a clique of millionaires with a few rare exceptions.
Yeah, I was just going to add that there's a really strong, and you referred to it. There's a really strong feminist content
Yeah.
to the movement in Rojava, because everything I've seen indicates that the leading roles, to the extent that there are leading roles, are largely taken up by women.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, let's move right on here, if we may. I don't see any other questions at the moment.
Ed Barcelone had
Ed.
Comment in the chat. Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
By the way, the article on Spain nailed the social political analysis of the country before the transition to quote unquote democracy after Franco died in 1975. It's important to remind that the Spanish Communist Party, PCE, did everything possible to suppress worker struggles from 75 to early 80s.
Thank you, Ed. And as you might know from his name, Ed originally comes from the Barcelona region, even though he's now in Canada. And yes, that I can say, in various ways, a lot of what happened in Spain, this was pretty much right on here. So now I want to spend a time just with the Watts article. Because that's sort of like in a different area here. And so it's called The Decline and Fall of the Spectacle Commodity Economy. This was written by Debord himself, by the way. Some of these other articles were maybe combinations of people. So Debord describes this riot in August 1965, and says everybody's horrified by it and all that. And so he says all the ideologies and so-called spokesmen of the vacuous international left deplored the irresponsibility, the disorder, the looting, especially the fact that arms and alcohol were the first targets, and the 2,000 fires with which the blacks lit up their battle and their ball. But who has defended the Los Angeles rioters in the terms they deserve? We will. And they're almost the only ones who did. Let the economists fret over the $29 million lost. The city planners sigh over one of their most beautiful supermarkets gone up in smoke. And McIntyre, the Catholic spokesman, blubber over his slain deputy sheriff. Let the sociologists bemoan the absurdity and intoxication of this rebellion. The role of a revolutionary publication, because this is appearing in that journal, is not only to justify the Los Angeles insurgents, but to help elucidate their perspectives, to explain theoretically the truth for which such practical action expresses the search. In Algiers in July 1965, following Boumedienne's coup d'etat, the Situationists issued an address to the Algerians and to revolutionaries all over the world, which interpreted conditions in Algeria and the rest of the world as a whole. Among other examples, we mentioned the movement of the American blacks, stating that if it, quote, could assert itself incisively, unquote, it would unmask the contradictions of the most advanced capitalist system. 5 weeks later, this incisiveness was in the streets. Modern theoretical criticism of modern society and criticism in acts of the same society already coexist, still separated, but both advancing toward the same realities, both talking about the same thing. These two critiques are mutually explanatory, and neither can be understood without the other. Our theory of survival and of the spectacle is illuminated and verified by these actions, which are so incomprehensible to American false consciousness. One day, these actions will in turn be illuminated by this theory. And a little later, when they're talking about the riots and the looting, looting is a natural response to the unnatural and inhuman society of commodity abundance. It instantly undermines the commodity as such, and it also exposes what the commodity ultimately implies. The army, the police, and other specialized detachments of the state's monopoly of armed violence. What is a policeman? He is the active servant of the commodity, the man in complete submission to the commodity, whose job is to ensure that a given product of human labor remains a commodity with the magical property of having to be paid for, instead of becoming a mere refrigerator or rifle, a passive, inanimate object subject to anyone who comes along to make use of it. In rejecting the humiliation of being subject to police, the blacks are at the same time rejecting the humiliation of being subject to commodities. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure that some of you will have some questions or comments about that article. Please proceed. Bruce.
There were a few other people that considered events like Watts a rebellion.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it wasn't the Situationists were not completely alone in that perspective. I know that people like H. Rap Brown described these events as rebellions. He never in any way
Oh, absolutely, of course.
never called them riots, and I'm sure other people who were subsequently associated with the Black Panther Party would have said essentially the same thing. And I know that for what it's worth, the Chinese communists, at least at that time when the Cultural Revolution was going on, were making posters celebrating these rebellions by Black people in the United States. So they didn't see it as just a riot. They were through art commenting on it as something that was not simply a riot. That it was a rebellion by oppressed people in the United States.
Yeah.
I remember seeing Chinese posters at the time of portraying blacks involved in these uprisings, and that's how they were portrayed.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Mike Ballard.
All right. There I am. I just a comment because nobody seemed to be saying anything. I was on Okinawa in the Marine Corps at the time, and it was 1965, of course. And I had Black friends, and a lot of the Southerners didn't like me because I had Black friends. But anyway, be that as it may, one of them who I'd known for a while sort of turned against me because I was a different color, right? So anyway, another aspect that I think needs to be explored a bit, and probably is because they've already said a lot of relevant things, is the idea of the lumpen proletariat being somehow potentially revolutionary. And I think that, from my own perspective, I've lived among a lot of lumpen proletarians, and I don't really see them responding to the theory of commodity production or anything like this, but it's more emotional, and an emotional reaction to being kicked around all the time. And so anyway, I think that like a lot of people, like in SDS, for instance, SDS did write a pamphlet about Watts. I remember it. I read it myself. But the thing of it is that a lot of people pinned a lot of hopes in the 60s on the possibility of the lumpen proletariat becoming the revolutionary force, and the proletariat being completely bought off. And I'm sure that that'll be explored later, but I just thought I'd bring it up. Thank you very much.
Yeah. For that, you may remember that the basic banalities that we talked about last time had a couple paragraphs in there where Vanagim talked about the lumpen proletariat. And he didn't say that it was, the great. He simply talked about how in the 19th century it had a very bad rep. Because it would be people like that were strike breakers or bullies, something. But he was just saying that in modern times, where it's understood that it's more a question of kind of being against wage labor as such, that the lumpens kind of come in a little bit more significantly as a potential. And absolutely by no means were the Situationists saying they were going to replace the proletariat or something like that. On quite the contrary. But they're just pointing out that, some of the proletariat was kind of, precisely if it was unionized, it was like, it was kind of bought off in certain ways, whereas some of these more lumpen people, which would include people like the blacks, most of the blacks of Watts, would, they can revolt too, and they can kind of reveal the problems in the system. So, other questions or comments?
I have a comment. Oh, let's take Sid.
Okay, Sid. You need to unmute yourself. I'm sorry. Now unmute yourself again. Okay, great.
I just wanted to say that I think, well, to start off with, I think this section that you just sort of pointed out and read, that it's brilliant, what they're saying. And a question, a thought that occurs when I'm reading is, this whole thing about looting and about Watts, et cetera, et cetera. So relating to recent stuff, and I said I was from Oakland, and there's been like, this, these activities like these gangs of people going into stores and stealing expensive handbags and things like that, and breaking into businesses and all of that. I wonder if that might be considered. It seems to me that that's a critique of commodity society. It may just be selfishness and wanting to get a bunch of stuff and get some money, but it also seems to me to be, at some level, at the risk of being slammed for saying this, that's that's a critique. It's also a critique of work as one. So I was just sort of wondering what people thought about that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And obviously, the mere fact that somebody steals something or vandalizes something or whatever is not itself, it could be seen as a kind of critique, but it's not like that's solving anything exactly. But the obvious thing, if a poor person is doing this, it's a sort of obvious critique of the system. Like, why does he have to do this? Because he doesn't have any money, and these things are prevented. You can have somebody stealing luxury items or this and say, well, that's not necessary. But it's the same idea. It's exposing the fact, like, as in that thing I read, that there's something magical about the commodity. And this is, they're really cribbing this from Marx. He says, Marx says in Capital, he says the commodity is a very mysterious, strange thing, because you would think that it's just this object here, but once it becomes a commodity, it has all these magical properties. You have to pay for it. The people who made it don't own it. So it ends up like these things end up dominating people as if they were gods or something. Anyway, that's you're right on there. I think we'll move on. Ed Stress.
Hi there. Sorry I'm late. And I missed last 2 week. A couple things. Yeah, I've been close to one of those gang raids, as they've been characterized, and what I heard from word of mouth around my area of Berkeley was that they were gang related, and I think um, the subtext there was that they were from Mexico and that the people that were doing them were addicted to drugs and needed the commodities to serve their habit. Now, I don't know how much that would change if that were true, which is like a big thing. How much that would change the Marxist analysis. I think the epidemic of drugs in San Francisco might shed some peculiar circumstances that, to use a Marxist analysis. And because I was late, I don't know if you've talked about the Battle of Algiers being an analogy, no, similar to, or perhaps the floor plan for what's going on in the Middle East now. I have heard that theory, and I think I came in on the end of someone addressing that. So if this is old hat, I apologize.
Well, I'm not sure, I want to stress, like with this Watts thing, people could take it simplistically as the Situationists were not saying, this is how to do it. This is what you do to overthrow this system. Emphatically not. What they're saying is that this is a symptom of this system. You know, this is what's going to happen when this system sort of goes crazy, crashes. And, if people are beating each other up, or if they're stealing stuff, even if they don't even need it, and if they're destroying buildings, or whatever they're doing, or even worse things like that. I mean, if they're killing each other, like, they are in some of these social conflicts, that this is a product of this system. And if you trace these things back, either they're directly economic kind of things, like somebody doesn't have money or things and somebody else has everything, or they are emotional or psychological or things, screw ups that are sort of the byproducts of that kind of society. And so that people will do a lot of things that really are crazy, and why are people doing crazy things? Well, because they're driven crazy. So when the Situationists point to these things, what they're doing, they're partly in a fight, in a struggle against all these other things, which we're going to be discussing in a few minutes here, that are saying, oh, it's not too bad. If you want to change this, we need to change this little thing over here. Or if you want to do this, here's an example. I'm going to make a film that has radical things in it. Or I'm going to, write a book like Sartre, and be sort of. So the Situationists are juxtaposing this kind of blunt, crude reaction, like in a riot or something, with the smooth rhetoric that the apologists, either apologists for the system or even people who pretend that they're against the system, but they have kind of a niche. They're the head of a party or a union or something like that. They have a career in they're an author or whatever. And so that's all that's going on there. Don't take this too much like there have been people, who read this article and said, oh, that's what to do it, yay. Somebody broke a window. Yay, the Situationists said that was cool because you're demystifying something. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Depends on the context. But the people in Watts doing it certainly were not doing it to imitate, something. They were just doing it out of frustration, and if they want to burn down a building, they say, fuck that, what's my life here? This is miserable. And I don't give a shit if you say that's not nice, or you should have sent a petition to somebody, or something like this. The Watts people, by the way, were reacting to a police brutality incident, as so often. So it was to some extent like the Black Lives Matter movement in recent years, except that the Watts people, it wasn't so organized, it was just like a spontaneous gut reaction, like, fuck this. If you just keep killing us or beating us up or arresting us, what should we care about this big supermarket building that's been ripping us off? And like that, or so anyway, any other questions? Anything in chat, Kim?
Yeah, there's 3 entries in the chat. So the first one's from Greg, and it says, it also says something that the state is now allowing people to, quote unquote, steal up to a certain amount without consequences. So that's Greg's comment. And then Ed Barcelone has a question, says, kind of related, but curious to know, what was your stand on the Black Panther Party back in the 60s? What were its blind spots, weaknesses as an organization?
Okay, I'll get back to that. What's the third question?
And the third one's from Sabrina, page 197, quote, people who destroy commodities show their human superiority over commodities, unquote. What about simply not valuing commodities and thus not consuming them? Isn't withdrawing from the commodity society as much as possible an equally valid action?
Actually, it might even be a more valid action if it worked. But as we know, it's very hard to withdraw from this society. I mean, even if you live off the grid, you're sort of a victim of it. You've got to be hiding all the time or something. And merely not buying more commodities is not really doing anything with the commodities. The commodity system is going to keep going. There are a lot of other factors there, regardless of whether one person or even many people don't buy some particular commodity or buy fewer of it or something. You can say, I mean, I personally, for example, don't buy a lot of commodities. I buy a lot of books and a few things, but I could say, well, I'm not buying a fancy car, or I'm not going on a vacation. So yay for me. But that's something. I mean, it's my choice, because I would rather not be bothered by. I don't give a shit about a lot of that stuff, and even if I do, I didn't want to devote my life to working so that I could afford to get it or something. So that's a logical decision that I've made for myself. And if a bunch of people did that, it might slightly modify the market, in the sense that maybe more people would publish books and less people would publish expensive cars or something. But it's not really changing the system. That's just that's a reasonable personal response to the system. But here, they're talking about people going a farther step. It may be a kind of crude step, but they are going farther, like something that I or many of us here even would not do for fear of getting arrested or hurt or something like that. But these people are doing it because they're desperate, or they're just mad. Even if they're not desperate, they're just and when they do something like that, it's kind of shocking. And you say, oh, the window's broken, that store window, and it's kind of scary. And I personally would rather not be there when it's happening, because it may lead to some more violent things. But the point is that part of the shock is that, wait a minute, you're not supposed to do that. That's somebody's property. It's like a religious, mystical thing. And it's like the word property is just this, oh, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. That's a sin, or whatever. You're just raising up this, and yeah, it's easier not to do that. But if people do that, it's definitely a sign that the system is not working well. It's not producing a satisfying, somebody with a satisfying life would never dream of doing something like that. So it's just, so I think that's it. To get back to the Black Panthers, I was a supporter of the Black Panthers when they first started around 1967 or 8 in there. And, actually in my autobiography, I have a little story about, I was at Free Huey rallies and all these things like this. And I went to one of their conferences, and you had to get a ticket to it. And so went to the Black Panther office, and I looked up at the wall, and they had a picture of Stalin on the wall. I mean, yeah, I mean, they were sort of Stalinist, but I mean, the idea that, like, they weren't even hiding it. They didn't even, they didn't have any other pictures to mix in. It was just a picture of Stalin, as if this is, one of our founding fathers. And I sat through the conference. It was a 3-day conference about fighting against fascism, this sort of rhetoric. But after it was over, I just sort of felt nauseated. I thought there's something fucked up about this. And that's when I went over to my friend in San Francisco, who was an anarchist, and I said, I want a bunch of your anarchist stuff. And I walked home with a sack full of anarchist books and pamphlets and read them. And after a day or two, I thought, yeah, now I understand. And in that context, of course, the Panthers would look horrible, because they were pretty Stalinist in their activities. You can understand them. Yeah, they're rebelling against, police brutality and all sorts of other things. So in that regard, okay, fine. But they really were like a gang, and somebody that my friends knew very well ended up being assassinated by Huey Newton's orders. And he wasn't, it was one of those things called black jacketing. How many of you have heard of COINTELPRO from back in the 60s and 70s? And one of the things they tried to do is to generate things like this. So they took this guy, his name was James Carr, and planted something so that the Black Panthers, like Jimmy Carr, was Huey Newton's bodyguard. So this is not an outside, and then at a little, and had been in prison a lot and all that kind of thing. And so something was planted on him such that the Black Huey Newton thought that he was a underground cop. And so, apparently what happened is that he just told 2 of his henchmen, go kill this guy. And they did. They just shot him. And those 2 people are in jail for life in California. They were caught. And so, this is not a if you say, oh, they gave free breakfast to children or something, which, okay. But, I mean, I think that says enough about that. So anyway, I was aware of that stuff at the time. So obviously, I don't think very highly of them. I can admire their courage or something for other things, but They were Stalinists. Bruce,
Yeah, on the Black Panthers, I mean, they were pretty open about this. They also admired Kim Il-sung in North Korea,
yeah,
and they very much identified with Mao Zedong. I mean, they and it was all rooted in this third world Marxist-Leninist perspective, which really was blind to the whole, essentially blind to the whole phenomenon of Stalinism.
yeah,
That almost all of these leaders of revolutionary movements in the third world that succeeded in taking power, be it Kim Il Sung or Ho Chi Minh or Mao, they all at one time or another had been admirers of Stalin. So I
yeah.
mean, the Black Panthers were completely melted into that whole ideological area,
Right.
right?
Anyway,
And so,
I think that's about enough about that. But I did write about that a little bit in my autobiography. So I'd like to move on here. These shorter articles, this interview with an imbecile. I assume most of you have read this, and you have this interview where they give this guy's remarks, and then the situationists come in and say, idiot, of course it's not this because it's the opposite, blah, blah, blah. And they give an example right at the end of the interview where they talk about the person in the interview has said, oh, when the question of Stalinism, actually, the bureaucratic power came up. This person says, oh, well, that's kind of complicated and blah, blah, blah. You'd have to prove there was class struggle, blah, blah, blah. And so they go on, they say this same imbecile that's been doing these interviews was so set on defending the interests of the Russian bureaucracy that, during the Russian crushing of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, that he took a position to the right of Khrushchev. Quote, this is the imbecile, the most serious mistake was probably Khrushchev's report on Stalin. For the solemn public denunciation, the detailed exposure of all the crimes of a sacred personage who has represented the regime for so long is a folly when such frankness is not made possible by a previous substantial rise in the standard of living of the population. The result was to reveal the truth to masses who were not ready to receive it, unquote. So then here's the Situationists talking in their own turn. They said, the thinker we've been talking about is Jean-Paul Sartre. Anybody who still wants to seriously discuss the value, whether philosophical or political or literary, one can't separate the aspects of this hodgepodge of such a nullity, so puffed up by the various authorities that are so satisfied with him, thereby reveals himself as not worth being taken seriously by those who refuse to renounce the potential consciousness of our time. So then another somewhat similar thing called the role of Godard, and it's a very scathing thing about Godard. And there's this, then they say, to be sure, films, like songs, have intrinsic powers of conditioning the spectator, beauties, if you will, that are at the disposition of those who presently have the possibility of expressing themselves in that medium. Up to a point, such people may make a relatively clever use of those powers, but it is a sign of the general conditions of our time that their cleverness is so limited and that the extent of their ties with the dominant ways of life quickly reveals the disappointing limits of their enterprises. Godard is to film what Henri Lefebvre or Morin is to social critique. Each possesses the appearance of a certain freedom in style or subject matter. In Godard's case, a slightly free manner in comparison with the stale formulas of cinematic narration. They make use of a caricature of freedom as marketable junk in place of the authentic. So again, the idea here, like with Sartre, is that this is somebody who is not just apologizing for the system. If the system is in trouble and is starting to be opposed in various ways, consciously or unconsciously, some of these people like Sartre or Godard step in, consciously or unconsciously, to say, hey, I'm going to ride that wagon. You know, it's now hip, it's now trendy to be against the system. And it's trendy to use détournement. It's trendy to quote Chairman Mao. It's trendy to have a picture of Che Guevara on your shirt, or, you know, whatever it is, they're going to latch onto that as a star of that kind of opposition. And so here's a third person, Daniel Guérin, who's a famous, he called himself a libertarian Marxist or a libertarian socialist. So kind of anarchist. He's edited an anthology of anarchist writings and so on, and some other interesting books. And so they point out that his article about Algeria, right around the same time they were writing theirs, was very strange in its analysis. And they point out these absurd things in it. And they say, what's wrong with this guy? You know, like here he was talking about being for self-management in Algeria, but then Ben Bella is overthrown and he doesn't really know what to say. And he says, what's the secret then of this aberration of one of our most famous leftist intellectuals and one of the most ostensibly libertarian among them at that, and in other words, anarchistic? With him, it is no different than with all the others. It is the decisive influence of their vainglorious participation in high society. Their common tendency, even more servile than a lackey's, to be swept off their feet with joy because they have spoken with the greats of this world, and the imbecility that makes them attribute such greatness to those who have condescended to talk with them, whether they are partisans of the self-managing masses, like Guérin, or of police state bureaucracies, like Stalinists. The leftist intellectuals of this period from which we are just emerging always have the same awestruck admiration for power and government. The closer they are to a governmental position, the more the leaders of the underdeveloped countries fascinate these ridiculous professors of leftist museology. So here is the secret. Guérin knew Ben Bella. He listened to him from time to time. He palled around with Ben Bella and he's so thrilled. So those are these three little, what I've called obstacles. Q&A about any of those? Sid? Okay, Ed Matthews?
Okay, I know we spoke very briefly that before we actually started the session. The issue with Godard, and when you place it in that perspective, that kind of jumping on the bandwagon, that is something that Godard can absolutely be accused of doing, because politically he was all over the place. But the period that he's being discussed here in 1966 was towards the tail end of this growing disillusionment with French cinema, sort of Hollywood cinema, traditional narrative, and the shift that he made following Weekend, which was basically his idea of the end of civilization, and then the very agitprop Marxist films that he made from 68 to 72. Certainly, I mean, in a couple of them, he actually quotes Debord, he quotes Venegem. So he's very much aware of who they are, and is using their ideas in a cinematic way. That's a period that I would have liked to find some information as to what Debord may have thought of his work during that period rather than 66. At that time, he's pretty tame, certainly, part of the new wave. but towards the tail end of the 60s, early 70s, his films changed very radically. And do you know of anywhere where Debord talks about his later period?
Just very briefly in 1969, if you look at the SI anthology, there's an article called Cinema and Revolution on page 378.
Okay.
It's another similar
yeah.
thing that's mostly anti-guitar, and that's 1969.
Okay, I stand
So
corrected.
you
then.
can look at that later.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions? Or if you want to say more, since you're into him or something,
Well, as I was saying before, it's for me now, having immersed myself in SI thinking, it is really difficult for me to watch Godard's movies without the ideas that were initially presented by the SI and how he co-opted some of his, some of his strategies. His was in Debord, but certainly ideas associated with the SI and trying to make something cinematic out of it. But it's really difficult for me now to separate the two. I'm going to take a look at that article from 69 and then perhaps rethink some of the films that he did, especially the one immediately following the May 1968, again, not the riots, but the general strike, where he tried to do the same thing, right? To sort of look through and sift through what had gone right, what had gone wrong. And of course, the SI writing in really about the same topic, they come to very different conclusions. So for me, at least, as a fan of Godard going back to 1980, when I saw his first film or exposed to him for the first time, I still like him. I just find it increasingly difficult to separate the SI and their ideas and their strategies from Godard's. I can't tell anymore which is which, because
there's also a critique of Godard's first film in this same book.
Okay.
When we get to past the journals, where we're in the thing of miscellaneous publications, it's on, and it's on page 393, and it's an extensive article by Debord called "For a Revolutionary Judgment of Art."
Okay.
And it's about Breathless, and it's about a socialism ou barbarie review of Breathless. So of course that's before the period you're talking about, but it gives you some. So you've got three things that are largely about Godard, three different articles. So check those out. Mike Ballard.
Hi. Did they have anything to say about that movie called The Battle of Algiers, which I was quite influential in circles I was running around in the late 60s?
Just a minute here. I want to get you on the thing here. Okay. I can tell you one mention of it. The American SI, which was just starting, around 1968 or 9, somewhere in there, put out a reissue of the Address to Revolutionaries in Algeria that we've read here, just as a little pamphlet. And on the back cover of it, as I recall, or something like that, they just they presented it something like, I can't quote exactly, but something like, in contrast to stupid shit like the Battle of Algiers, this is what was really going on in Algeria. So they just thought it was a bunch of shit. And I know it was a famous movie. I saw it, and oh, this is dramatic and so on. But it's just, if you think about the film, and then you look at these things that the SI was talking about, they're not even in the same worlds. That film is just, there's a mode that is just like moaning, like, oh, this is so bad. These people, French imperialists are doing this, they're torturing people, they're doing blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, that's something, and it could be, like in that case, more or less true. But it's the farthest thing, like nothing is going to happen, this is just like you're playing like an election. You're trying to say, oh, because we'll say this is so bad, then people should be disgusted and oppose it. And very often that doesn't happen at all, as we see, in current events so many times, that there could be plenty of things about, how bad, napalm was in Vietnam and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, that's not mistaken. Like if you did something like saying this is an outrage, what we're doing in Vietnam or something like this. But if that's all that this film or something amounts to, it's something. Yeah. I mean, it's something just like throwing a brick through a store window is something. You can say it's a reaction against an outrage, but it's not really contributing very much. Whereas the SI, who may seem more cold-blooded in how they analyze these things, they're actually look, what is this going on here? Like, like what forces are at play, what choices are there, instead of just saying, oh, horrible, we must elect somebody who will stop that. I mean, it's not contributing to either to people in France or Algeria or anywhere else to say, all you can do is say, well, it's horrible, which they're already seeing on the newscasts and stuff like that to some extent. But it's like, as to who is to blame or what is to blame or what the alternatives might be, are kind of left rather vague. And people come out of the film and they say, oh my God, what a moving film. That's horrible. Oh. And then go about their business. In most cases, it's just, it can be almost like a porn thing or something like that. It's just, you're excited to denounce this or that, or you're horrified at this or something. Maybe in some cases you've learned some new information, but in so many cases, people don't do anything with it anyway, and that's where like Debord's films are like at the other pole of this kind of film, that's just, that's enough said.
Right, but I just one other comment is that the people who claim to be revolutionaries, vanguard of the revolution and all that sort of thing, they celebrated the film in terms of its glorification of direct action and violence. And I remember well seeing the film and watching some Algerian go up to some authority of France and shooting them in the head and then blowing up a stadium and things like this. And this tended to be taken seriously by people who had, I think, they were just basically vacuous when it came to theory. They thought, this is the way to go. What we'll do is we'll blow up a toilet in Washington. And, this will show them. We'll throw a brick through the window as we're going down the street. And the cops will come and attack us, and and then the revolution will happen, and all this kind of thing. So that's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
But I know about the critique and everything. In fact, one of the films that Debord did, I think he did, was called Can Dialectics Break Bricks?
No, that was Rene Vianney. That's not Debord.
Okay. Oh, sorry. That's
really an interesting film, but it's not on the level of Debord, but it's doing a much more interesting thing, though. It's pulling the rug out from under people instead of leading people to identify with somebody.
Yeah, it takes the rug out of it sort of makes fun of ultra violence, which is to my, well, in the circles I was running around in at the time, was sort of being celebrated. You
Yeah.
know, we have to pick up the gun and all this kind of
Right.
shit, right?
No, I understand. I was there.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't pick up the gun, but you know, I was around people like that was in the air, and you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
it sounds convincing because around the world somebody is fighting in a war, and you think, oh gosh, maybe that's the way to. I mean, we got our independence from England by picking up the gun, you know, and things like that. So it's not that it's
Exactly.
completely idiotic, but it's just you have to look at the context and say, is the things you're talking about actually going to bring that to happen, or
Right.
in many cases it's quite the contrary. You know,
Right.
it makes people think, gosh, we need more police, or we need a strong government to stop this kind of
Exactly.
thing. You know, this is ridiculous. Otherwise, it's going to. Okay. So I think we'll move on to the last set of things here. There was this article starting on 220, not really an article by Vanagem. It's basically a list of topics that he's proposing. He's saying these are topics that are worth investigating, analyzing, exploring. But he makes the distinction, like we're not talking about an academic dissertation here. We're talking about what use can these be? And then he lists all these different kind of revolutions in the past and different kind of ideologies and arts and topics about everyday life or urbanism and so on. The topics are interesting. And then following that, 2 pages later, we have Captive Words, preface to a Situationist Dictionary by Mustafa Kayati, the Tunisia member of the SI, who also wrote On the Poverty of Student Life, which we'll be reading 2 weeks from now. And so I think we, to some extent, in that article we read called All the King's Men, was about sort of like poetry and revolution. This overlaps that in a lot of ways. But you know, it's basically talking about the ambiguities of language, like it's a terrain that is struggled over. So there can, you know, when people mention Marxist-Leninists, for example, you know, that was just a contrived thing. You know, I don't think there's really any such thing. They wanted to link Lenin to Marx so that whenever you would think of them, you would think of them together, as if that just meant that they were like Siamese twins or something. And so instead of actually talking about Marx, who is quite different than Lenin, actually, let alone Stalin. Then there's an article, so I'm not going to go into that more. There's an article at a little further on called Dominic versus Alienation. Dominic was some Catholic priest, intellectual. And apparently, you know, he had written some article saying, let's get rid of alienation, meaning the term. And because he said, you know, he argued that this term is used for so many different things, it just doesn't mean anything anymore. People use it as an insult, or, you know, it can mean so many different things. And they point out in this kind of people like Dominic being themselves valets of the establishment's cultural spectacle, which wants to quickly co-opt for its own use the most crucial terms of modern critical thought, will never want to admit that the truest and most important concepts of an era, such as alienation, dialectics, communism, are precisely marked by the organization around them of the greatest confusions and the worst misinterpretations. Vital concepts like those are simultaneously subject to the truest and the most false uses, along with a multitude of intermediary confusions. Because the struggle between critical reality and the apologetic spectacle leads to a struggle over words, a struggle that is more bitter the more those words are central. The truth of a concept is not revealed by an authoritarian purge, like saying, we shall not use that anymore, but by the coherence of its use in theory and in practical life. And then the last article, called The Ideology of Dialogue, comes back to that notion of the situationist breaks and, you know, what's going on there. And in this article, they focus on the idea that people in the society, like spokespeople or intellectuals or, you know, whatever, writers, media people, would like to say, we're all in one big dialogue here. Free speech, you know, we can say what we want, and then we can agree to shake hands afterwards and all that. And the situationist authors are saying this kind of thing is a fake dialogue. It's fake because nothing's really going on. No decisions are being made. Nothing's going to come of it. It's just yakking. And you yak, and then there may be a pretense of debate or argument. And then when it's over, you shake hands. And then you say, well, we've had some interesting ideas to think about here this evening and all that. And the situationists are saying that kind of dialogue is bullshit. And we are not interested in taking part in it and pretending that it means something, pretending that, you know, whatever. So then to quote from this, so much of this article is taken up by excerpts from two letters that the Situationists wrote with one of their contacts in East Europe. Later on, we happen to know who that is, and I mentioned him in the note. He was somebody in Czechoslovakia. But at the time, of course, they would not give out his name in this public thing. But they quote two letters, which were both by Debord, writing to this person, like an intellectual radical guy in Prague, and clarifying, you know, who that person presumably had some interest in the Situationists, but was asking them, well, what about these breaks you're talking about, or whatever. And so Debord is explaining that we're not talking about the kind of things that happens in Stalinist countries where you become a non-person or you're arrested or even executed. So in contrast to that, so Debord is saying, for 1,000 reasons, of which the experience of the Eastern Bloc, in other words, East Europe, is the most obvious, we know that an ideology in power turns any partial truth into an absolute lie. We, the Situationists, are not a power in society, and thus our exclusions only express our freedom to distinguish ourselves from the confusionism around us, or even among us, which confusionism is much closer to the actual social power and partakes of all its benefits. We have never wished to prevent anyone from expressing their ideas or doing what they want, and we have never sought to be in a position to exert such pressure. We merely refuse to be ourselves mixed up with ideas and acts that run contrary to our convictions and tastes. So I'm going to stop there. So we have those last four things that I briefly touched on. Any questions or comments about them?
Judy has her hand up.
Judy? Okay.
Oh yeah, I had the Captive Words article. I wanted to ask John, because he's a poet, what was his take on this whole diatribe about poetry, which I couldn't really understand very well. I wonder if he had anything to say about it. 225, page 225. It abolishes poetry without realizing it, living off its own continual self-destruction, blah, blah, blah. John, did you have any words of wisdom about that whole section of poetry?
Welcome, John. Go for it. Let's see. We're not hearing you, John, although you seem unmuted.
Yeah, I think your audio needs to be activated, John.
We're not hearing you.
If you post your question in the chat, we could pull it from there.
Well,
Or your
it's
comment.
not his question. He's responding to
Your
Judy's
comment.
question.
Yeah, your comment.
So we want to hear him.
Right.
We're not hearing you, John. Look on your
John,
microphone.
you need to go into preferences on your laptop or your computer and activate your audio. You need to activate your microphone.
John, if you look in your screen, if you look in your screen, you'll see a little thing in the extreme lower left that says mute. So if you click that arrow, not just the mute, but the arrow, maybe it will say that you are, you're using the wrong microphone or something. Okay, now try unmuting yourself. Yeah, we're still not getting you. Okay, see what you work on it. We'd like to get back to you. Ed Matthews.
Yeah, just two very quick things. When I think of the sort of the gist of the ideology of dialogue, it reminds me of this word that drives me nuts these days. We need to have a conversation. We need to have a conversation about this. And to me, it sounds like the person telling me that is, I have no intention of changing anything, but I'm going to let you talk for a few minutes and make you think like, I'm listening. And it is so irritating because I hear it, especially in school, we have to have this conversation. Oh, no, I know we're not going to, because you're going to ignore me the moment I leave the room. So I get that's where they're coming from. Another very brief issue here with captive words. I don't know if you wanted to speak any more about it, but the idea of the Situationist dictionary, I followed that through with a lot of the letters that Debord had written to Kayati. And they eventually realized, in fact, it was Debord that said, look, this is kind of counterintuitive, because we're going to create a dictionary where we talk about how language has a certain power over us. And here we are trying to pin down the meaning of certain words, and they can't, right? We can't do that, because we can talk about certain ideas, but the notion of a situationist dictionary is almost a contradiction, because if language, as it says, language is the house of power, here we are trying to take ownership of them, and we shouldn't. It took a few years. I think about 69, the idea was maybe mentioned one or two more times, but they decided at that point that it would make more sense to simply write short theory pieces so an idea could be explained, rather than having this thing called the dictionary, which would be exactly the opposite of what they were fighting against.
Now, we saw an early example in that article on gangland and philosophy, where Cotigny says, I propose a new definition, a neighborhood is a racket, or, stuff like that. So obviously you can do something like that and sort of okay, that's got an impact. But if you were strictly defining it like that way, it wouldn't, that's just sort of like a momentary slogan, like a graffiti, like cops are this or something. You're not really saying this is the definition, or at least if you are, as you mentioned, it's a little better to write a brief thing where you explain what's going on here, rather than just countering one definition with another definition.
Mhm.
No, it's not that, it's that. John, we're still seeing you there, but no, we still can't hear you. John, why don't you try leaving the group and coming back in? I don't know if that will do any good, but okay. So meanwhile, any other comments or questions?
There are a number of statements
Okay, go
in
for it.
the chat, but they go back to the essay.
That's okay. That's
So
okay.
Steve has a comment. He says food is a commodity.
Right.
And then Ed Stress asked, well, what about boycotting commodities from, say, South Africa or Zionist? Of course, there is a BDS movement that's been in existence for a number of years to boycott commodities from Israel.
Yeah. Well, let's go for those first two. The thing about food, of course, some commodities are useful. It's not saying that commodities are evil or something, or the goods, let's say that the goods are evil. The problem is a system that turns all those goods and bads into commodities, i.e. things for sale. If they're not for sale, if they're just food, then fine. Could be good food, bad food, a lot of food, little food. That's just part of life. And we dealt with that before we ever had commodities. A primitive person doesn't need to buy, come up with some money to buy some food, whatever society they're in. As for boycotting, yeah, that sometimes works, but very often it doesn't work. It's not a guaranteed thing. But for example, during the civil rights movement, there was a boycott of the Montgomery, Alabama buses because they were segregated. And it actually won after a while. It was very inconvenient for the Black people because they had to walk to work or, do some kind of carpooling or something like this. But eventually, either because it was hurting the bus business or because it was also kind of a publicity thing, they ended up giving the bus company and or the Montgomery City Council or whatever gave in. And of course, we have the experience. When I was first in California, there was a grape strike that went on for years that was in favor of support of the farm workers. And eventually they won. But until they won, nobody bought any grapes. I mean, some people did, but if you were, sympathetic, you didn't buy grapes. You bought apples or something else. So sometimes those things have some good effects, but a lot of times, where it's conceived of as just sort of a moral thing, like, well, I don't buy material made with this or something. Nobody ever even knows that you don't buy, and they couldn't give a shit if they did know.
I've heard it said
it's only going to have an effect if there's massive people and it's a fairly simple thing to do.
I've heard it said it's the only thing that does seem to have worked. We won the boycott. South Africa went through some changes. The Great Boycott.
Yeah, it only took about
like
30 or 40 years.
Yes,
that was what did it.
But
Actually,
it does seem like it's the
most
one
of
the
what did
main
it for
tools.
South Africa was South Africans rebelling.
Yeah, right.
I mean, if it hadn't been for that, nobody would have cared particularly if we didn't buy some of their products, because then some other country would buy them. You know, it's
Good point.
I mean, the example that's in that article about Spain that we read this time, the Situationists point out that there was, for decades, there had been a boycott of travel to Spain, urged on by anarchists, you know, the Spanish anarchists, because they're saying this is a dictator, a murderous dictator there. Don't support that economy by taking your vacation in Spain. And it never had any effect, because if you're like a poor French worker, going to Spain may have been the only vacation you could afford. Whereas if you don't go to Spain, they think, well, that's not going to do anything. So the Situationists actually, in that case, go back and read the last page or page and a half of that Spain article. They say, okay, we've got a suggestion, you know, that's going to be a little more specific. And that is that the workers in these workers' commissions or whatever will say, there's all these foreign people buying cheap property in Spain. You know, your vacation home, you know, that you can buy for dirt cheap. And it's kind of hard to resist, you know, but that's not the poor workers doing that. That's middle to upper class people doing that. And so the Situationists just suggest a possible type of boycott, which I think is an interesting one. They say, tell the world that if you buy property in Spain and you're not, you know, you're in France or Germany or something, and we come into power, you know, not Franco and these other things, we will not acknowledge your ownership of that. In other words, you will have put in all this money and we are going to confiscate it. We are not going to recognize the deed because that deed was made by a fascist government or blah, blah, blah. And so they were saying that this is a little clearer a class thing, and it doesn't cost anything to do it. You don't have to go out of, you know, like if you want to come to Spain, you know, that we're not going to stop that. It's just like trying to fight a tidal wave or something. But it is a kind of neat thing to say, you know, take thought, you guys that want to invest in Spain, in Spanish property, because it may not be safe. You know, you may lose your money. Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, sometimes boycotts work, but a lot of times they don't. I mean, there are thousands of boycotts going on as we speak, and most of them nobody even knows they're happening. You know, so it's just every once in a while, it just, yeah, and you can't predict. Every once in a while, something clicks, and yeah, everybody joins in, and then it does have an effect. But more often than not, everybody doesn't join in, and it just discourages people, and nothing happens. And meanwhile, they've gone to a great length. You know, they said, I'm going to boycott the airplanes, or I'm going to boycott this or something, you know, and it just means that they have to go to a lot more trouble if they're traveling across the country. The airlines don't give a shit. They don't even know it's happening, that you have a personal thing against airlines or something.
So John is back. Can we hear him?
Hi,
There
can
you
you?
are.
Yay!
Oh, I'm so sorry for wasting your time.
Oh, no problem.
And thank you for the question, Judy. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to give a little background of what was going on at that time. When they say modern poetry, experimental, permutational, spatialist, surrealist, or neo-Dadaist, is the antithesis of poetry. It is the artistic project co-opted by power. And then they go on to say, the specialists of language arrive at the concept of language, object, and word thing. And this was at the time of concrete poetry. And it was Marshall McLuhan with The Media is the Message, and photographs were going around the world. You could see a photo and more or less there's a cultural difference, but you can catch what's going on. And the poets got frustrated by text needing to be translated. So they came up with this thing of like putting poetry on the wall, or neon poetry, or furniture poetry. And that was the concrete poetry movement. And people thought they were making some kind of breakthrough. And what was going on here is, of course, that the Situationists said, this is just bullshit. It's another little branch off of art. And now that some people are becoming famous as the practitioners of this concrete and spatialism and these other movements, as they were, you know, of course, I would agree with the Situationists from their point of view that they would be criticizing this, because they were even purging the artists in their own group who were becoming famous and making money. So anything that had this kind of trend and smell of the media picking it up, I can understand how they would be putting it down. On the other hand, you know, one doesn't write poetry to please people. You know, you write poetry because you want to or have to or whatever. But so who cares what they say about anything, you know, in that regard.
Now, I would recall in that part, remember in that early Situationist conference, where Cotigny suggested that they call situationist art anti-situationist art. And he specifically said, I don't mean that we should stop writing or stop. I don't mean that we could do that. I mean, at that time, the majority of the situationists were some kind of artist, a filmmaker or a writer or a painter or whatever.
And
So,
the Chilean
but that's
poet,
kind of neither here nor there. It's just saying
right,
it's the pretense that by
yes,
doing this is the thing, you know, this is going to change things, and it's a
right,
noble pursuit and all this
exactly.
that they weren't buying, you know.
Right. And Nicanor Parra in Chile actually wrote poems and always called them anti-poems. So, you know, that was going on too, because people didn't want to acknowledge that the poetry in the 60s was of anything like the traditional stuff. So it had to make that break. And part of it was just saying, this isn't poetry.
Yeah.
But it was a new kind of poetry, as with the beats and all that other stuff.
Right.
But of course, the Situationists, I mean, I love their kind of way of criticizing in totality the society, the way the Dadaists did in the 20s. It's like everything is corrupt, everything is putrid. It's not, you know, the art can't be pure and the economy and the politics be bad. It's like it's all part of the same shitstorm, you know, as Peter Tosh said.
Okay, we're getting on in time here. Any further comments or questions before we wind down?
Well, there were more comments in the chat. John had the next one after what we already went through. MLK's photographer and his inner circle turned out to be an undercover cop. Ron Karenga was an agent for the cops while being a bodyguard for Baraka. So John had that to say. And then Sid asked, how do Trotskyists relate to Stalinists? And then John again, J. Edgar Hoover knew how to use paranoia. And Ed Barcelone asked, didn't Paul Goodman write an essay on how to make effective films dealing with violence and war?
Yes, and it's on my website. I put it on there. It's called I think it's called Designing Pacifist Films. And I'll mention that. Let's see. Go back to continue reading those chat things, Kim.
Well, that's all except
okay. Go
Mike
back.
Ballard left his email address and said thanks for the session. He had to leave.
Oh, okay. So what were the things you mentioned just like a minute or two ago again?
Well, Sid asked, how do Trotskyists relate to Stalinists?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a big thing there, and I will. When I helped translate this Vietnam book called In the Crossfire, I wrote a little short thing on Stalinism and Trotskyism, just because it was referred to so much in the book that I wanted to. So I go through the different trajectories of those two tendencies in there. And I think, but very briefly, Trotsky and Lenin are both more credible than Stalin, for sure, because Stalin ended up being the sort of most notorious tyrant of all time or something, whereas Trotsky and Lenin died soon after the revolution. So, and Trotsky was, demoted and then exiled by Stalin in the late 20s. So he had been an important leader. Trotsky and Lenin were the two most important leaders in the Bolsheviks. But Trotsky was forced out of power before he had too much of a chance to do bad things. He did some bad things, like he crushed the Kronstadt sailors and betrayed Makhno in the Ukraine and so on. But he was out of there before he had, whereas Stalin was in power and we got to see the ugly truth, as it becomes more like concentration camps in Siberia, the Moscow trials, all this kind of stuff that then continued on with Mao Zedong and all the, Kim Il-sung and so many other Stalinist leaders. So Trotsky could look better. He could say, well, let's get back to authentic Marxism, Leninism here, not the Stalinist, perverse direction. But if Trotsky had been in power, there's not that much evidence he would have done things any differently. He was already one of the architects of the police state kind of regime, even in the early 20s. So, but because he was there and then he was assassinated by a Stalinist in Mexico in the late 1930s, I think, he still had a better reputation, like Lenin. And so you have these eternal groups saying, oh, if we get back an authentic Trotskyist thing and not the Stalinist thing, it's just like the union, eternal union elections where somebody's elected, then they become corrupt, and then somebody else says, let's kick this corrupt guy out, and then he gets elected and he becomes corrupt. Let's get this corrupt guy, and it's like they're not looking at the fact that there's something wrong with that type of organization. It's not just that there's a bad guy there, but for some reason, bad guys end up there. And it's because that's where the power is. And once you're there, all this. So Bruce, let's see here. No, sorry. Okay. Bruce, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I'll be quick because of the time. My perspective, and I speak as someone who in high school actually was a Trotskyist for a while. And I subsequently became a Soviet studies major in university. My perspective on Trotsky is simple. There are two Trotskys. There's Trotsky when he was in power, and there's Trotsky after he was kicked out of power and became the great critic of the Soviet regime and all its anti-democratic practices. And while he was in power, he promoted the militarization of labor. As you noted, he did Kronstadt. He was the most iron-fisted of all the leading Bolsheviks when he was in power. And then he did a complete turn in the other direction after he lost power. And I think, and I really like what Emma Goldman said about Trotsky in his later years. He said, well, Trotsky complains too much. But no, that's my perspective on Trotsky. If you contrast Trotsky while he was in power with the things he said after he was out of power, I mean, the difference is stark.
Right. Yeah. So I'll send you the link to that article I wrote, and there's it's an endless topic of discussion there, but there is a reason why in the address to revolutionaries in Algeria they mention Trotskyism, here's how they, let's see. And, you know, so many of these situationist things are very strategic. They're very pithy. They don't waste words. So if they say, well, what are we going to say about Trotskyism? They've got just the half sentence to make it perfect. They say, the domination of bureaucratic state capitalism, in other words, like Stalinism, over the workers is the opposite of socialism. This is a fact that Trotskyism has refused to face. So they don't go into details, you know, because in this case, the details don't really, you know, you can sum it up in those 10 words or something, you know, that when Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, the Bolsheviks, took over, they ended up setting up a new kind of class society. They didn't abolish class society, they just changed it where the people at the top were a bureaucracy instead of a bunch of capitalists. And so that's what the Situationists are saying here. It says this thing is not socialism, it's the opposite. But Trotskyists or Trotskyism just cannot face that, because they have to say, oh, back in the days of Trotsky and Lenin, things were great. It's just this perversion that Stalin came in, as if that was an accident and wasn't right in line with what Trotsky and Lenin had been building on. It's not that Trotsky and Lenin intended to build a police state. You know, they intended to have a great revolution and all that, but once they kind of got in the swing of it, you know, they did what kind of came naturally. Oh, we got to stay in power, therefore we got to kill those people, you know, all that. So enough of that. Thank you for coming. And 2 weeks from now, we'll have what is probably going to be our most fun meeting, because it's just about one topic, the Strasbourg scandal. And that scandal has an article by the SI about it. It has this pamphlet called On the Poverty of Student Life, a short pamphlet, but that pamphlet is sort of like a Situationist manifesto and has been translated into more than 24 languages. And it's a fun thing. And there's a book here that you have to know French in order to read it, but it's an excellent book. It's called The Scandal of Strasbourg by Those Who Did It. And it's by two of the people who were participants in that scandal, along with some of the SI people. And so it was a fun thing. It was a real coup they did. And so I think it will be illuminating, maybe inspiring about things one might do. And so hope to see you then.
Could I make one last comment?
Sure, go ahead.
I just want, for anybody who's not familiar with it, if you really want to understand how things went bad in the Soviet Union, I think the best book that sums it up from a worker's perspective is Maurice Brenton's book, The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control. Yeah. It really nails it in terms of, you know, how the revolution was completely unraveled and reversed. Right. And even the Spartacist League, the most outrageous Trotskyists of all, admitted in one of their pamphlets that it was well researched.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Bruce.
That book is particularly good in that respect.
No, I agree. I've recommended that in various things of my own writings. Okay, so hope to see you in a couple weeks.
What's the name of it again?
Well, I'll write it down.
Workers' Control.
The what?
The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control.
Bolsheviks.
I'll put it in my email. Okay, out of here. See you in a couple weeks, or in a few cases in 1 week if you're in my lit group.
You're all invited to my birthday party around November the 19th weekend. I don't know where it's going to be yet, but I will send further advertisements.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
See you all.
Thanks,
Actually,
Ken.
I'm not going to end. Peter and Kim, if you're still around, we can, I don't think we have anything to say, but let's see. Kim and Peter. Yeah, if your name is not Kim or Peter, you can leave. Okay. Bye-bye. See you, Annie. Any technical issues or comments?
Kim did most of the heavy lifting.
Okay.
No, I didn't have any problems. I think everything went pretty smoothly.
Oh, did you think to do the screenshot?
Yeah, I did it.
Oh, great.
I'll send it to you.
We didn't get many. I don't know if we ever got over
It
even
was
more
only
than
20.
Got about 20. Well, yeah, there's including us, so there's about 17.
No, I saw 20.
Yeah,
that
there were,
includes
well,
us.
including us.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I count us in the thing there.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm kind of disappointed there aren't more people, but again, I assume that there's a bunch of people watching the YouTube things.
Yeah.
Because I can see that.
That happens at City Lights too. It's like, we'll have about 60 people sign up and about 40 show up, and then the rest you'll see them come through YouTube.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. And
Sure.
so
You're
Kim, I'll see you in a week. And Peter, you're always welcome to show up if you want the
Thank
Arabian
you.
Nights thing, but I think you're on the list if you're interested. But
I
I'll
am.
see you in 2
Yeah.
weeks.
If I don't get caught up in my dad duties or City Lights, I will definitely be around.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Kim. All right.
Yeah.
See you, Kim. Take care.
Okay, bye, Peter. Bye, Ken.
Bye.